after that presentation. A very tough act to follow, but I think we have the act. Professor Celia Marr is Head of Internal Medicine at Rosdale's Equine Hospital in the UK. She's an RCVS, and European Specialist in Equine Internal Medicine. She's editor of the world-respected Equine Veterinary Journal. She's also worked in veterinary schools in Glasgow, Pennsylvania, Cambridge and London, and has also worked in racehorse practice in Lambourn. She has a particular interest in cardiology, medical imaging and intensive care. We are very lucky at Troytown Greay Veterinary Hospital that Celia has agreed to join us as a consultant. Celia is a great addition to the team at Troytown Greay Abbey, a practice which was formed in January this year by the amalgamation of the former Greay Abbey Veterinary Hospital and Troytown Equine Hospital. With Celia on board, our clients will now have immediate access to the most up-to-date information and treatments, which is especially useful in very difficult cases. Celia will also be visiting Troytown Greay Abbey regularly to provide consultancy service as needs arise. I've always wondered about the precise relationship between heart size and performance, as the heart is the powerhouse for performance. It's a very interesting subject, and we have a leading world expert to throw some light onto it for us. Celia Marr.
Thank you very much. I probably worried more about having to follow Sir Mark than most of the talks that I do, because I'm kind of conscious that probably as trainers you would be far more interested to hear what he has to say. But for better or worse, I selected the subject, the equine heart, and I wanted really to pose the question: is big always better? And for the next 25 minutes or so, hopefully I can present to some extent the case both for and against. So just start off with some cardiac anatomy. I think people don't always realise when you look at the horse from the outside just how large the equine heart is. So what we've got here is a CT scan showing the internal organs of the horse, and I've put that against obviously a photograph of this horse, just so that you can understand exactly how big the heart is. So the heart lies obviously at the front of the chest, and all this area here is occupied by heart. If the horse is standing more or less square, the back of his triceps muscle marks the back of the heart, and most of what goes on in front of that, almost to the shoulder, is heart tissue. Now, we talk about the heart as being divided into 4 separate chambers. The top chambers, the function of those is to fill the heart, and they're called the atria, and then the main pumping chambers are called the ventricles. And conventionally, we know the 2 halves of the heart as the right and the left, although that is extrapolated from humans and doesn't really immediately apply to the horse. But this again is a CT representation. The purple area is the right side of the heart, and the main purpose of the right side is to pump blood out to the lungs, where it picks up the oxygen and then carries it back. The yellow area is the left side of the heart, and the main function of the left side of the heart is that's what takes the blood, carrying the oxygen as it comes back from the lungs and pumps it out to the body. So the left side is regarded as the main pump to provide the oxygen to the tissues. Now, all horses have fairly large hearts, but the thoroughbred as a breed has proportionately larger hearts. So the typical thoroughbred heart weight is around 1% of its body weight, whereas other breeds, less athletic breeds, the heart weight will be lower than that, maybe nearer to 0.8% of their body weight. And obviously, everyone knows really the heart is the engine. It has a central role in delivering the fuel. That's why we need the heart. It pumps the oxygen to the muscles and the other tissues. And I was talking about this at lunchtime. It's important to remember that the heart is only one component of a whole cardiovascular system. So the blood vessels that carry the blood to the tissues, and the function within the tissues, the ability of the tissues to extract oxygen from the blood, and of course the red blood cells which carry the oxygen, are all additional important components So although for this particular presentation I'm going to focus on the heart, an important message is that there's no point in having the world's most efficient heart if the rest of the system lets you down. So just one or two facts about the heart. The resting heart rate in a horse is about 25 to 30 beats per minute. But if a vet comes in with a stethoscope and listens to the horse's heart, they very rarely actually can record it that low. Even just the process of standing next to the horse will put his heartbeat up a little bit. So typically when we record a heart rate with a stethoscope, we would consider about 35 to 45 to be normal. But if there are many different monitoring systems that we have nowadays, if you put a heart rate monitor on a horse and leave him quietly in a stable on his own, particularly through the middle of the night, the heart rate will go down into the 20s. On the other hand, when the horse is galloping, his heart rate goes up to 220 to 240, so that's a tremendous range, far greater than our own range, where even sort of fit people will maybe have a heart rate of about 60 and it will go up to perhaps 180 at peak exercise. You can see how the whole equine species is adapted to be an athlete. The stroke volume, which is the term that describes the amount of blood that leaves the heart each beat, is almost a litre. So every time the heart beats, about almost a litre of blood leaves it. And so if you work that out to number of beats per minute, the resting cardiac output is about 38 litres per minute. And I find that, 38 litres per minute, what does that really mean? I was thinking about it yesterday when I was filling up my car with petrol, and there on the thing it said those petrol things deliver at 5 litres a minute. So it's like, I guess, whatever it is, 6 or 8 of those pumping all at the same time is equivalent to a horse's heart. And that's the resting heart rate, of course. When they're galloping, that can go up 5 to 7-fold. So tremendously efficient heart. And in some ways, we can regard the heart as actually being, well, it's not the weakest link. That's the problem. The weak links in the system, the performance limiting components of all of this are probably the blood vessels and to some extent the lungs. Horses are far more likely to get respiratory disease, as you all know. And it's also true that horses can actually have some degree of mild heart disease without it necessarily affecting their performance particularly much, because their heart is so efficient in the first instance. So what about heart size? Well, it's been a long held theory that heart size is very important in the thoroughbred, and this can go back, it traces back really to Eclipse. Eclipse was thought to have a particularly large heart. Apparently it was measured at 14 pounds, and in fact the people at the time who looked at Eclipse's heart were so dumbfounded by this massive heart that they decided to set up the Royal Veterinary College in London, specifically with the intention of studying equine physiology and trying to work out why Eclipse was such a superior athlete, and also presumably how they could get some more Eclipses. Nearer in this century, Farlap, an Australian horse, also had, apparently he was a descendant of Farlap, he also had a heart that was 14 pounds. And this piece of text here, which I know you can't read, but I can, is taken from the Wikipedia entry for Secretariat, because of course he's another great horse that was known to have a very large heart. The Secretariat, for some extraordinary reasons, so when Secretariat died, he had a post-mortem done, and if you go to Wikipedia you can read the story, but they were so impressed by this heart that they forgot to weigh it. It's described that they just looked on in amazement, and presumably all their brains fell out, because they don't actually know how heavy his heart was, but they guessed it was about 22 pounds. And they came up with that figure because they looked at Sham, who was apparently his nearest rival, and his heart they did remember to weigh, and it was about 18 pounds. So these are all very large hearts, because as I've just told you, the typical typical heart weight is about 5 kilos, 3 to 5 kilos probably, whereas these horses have hearts in the range of 6 to 10 kilos in the case of Secretariat, although I would emphasise they didn't actually weigh that. So what does it matter? Where's the evidence that the heart is important? Well, there's been some very important research funded by the Horse Race Betting Levy Board. And just as an aside, if you're interested in thoroughbred research, the HBLB have a website, which you can see here, that publishes about every fortnight or once a month or so. They put a little update about research going on in the world of thoroughbreds, and they'll send you alerts and things like that. So if you are interested in hearing about that, go to that site and you can get the alerts sent. But anyway, the HBLB has funded quite a lot of work over the years in all aspects of thoroughbreds disease and well-being and physiology and so forth. But they've done some work related to the heart. And one of the studies that they funded was done at the Animal Health Trust in Newmarket by Leslie Young and colleagues. They were interested to see whether heart size related to oxygen delivery. Is a larger heart actually more efficient than a smaller heart? If you look at this graph here, what we've got along here is an estimate of heart size, so that each dot along here is representing larger and larger hearts, and up on this side they've measured the efficiency of oxygen delivery. And you can see that there is quite a good correlation that as the heart gets bigger, in the horses with the larger hearts also have the more efficient oxygen delivery. So that's a good start. That shows that heart size is important, and it enables the horse to deliver oxygen to his tissues more efficiently. Now, how can we measure heart size in the field situation, if you like? Well, the answer is fairly easily. We can use ultrasound, and that allows you to look inside the heart, just as you can look inside tendons and other areas you're perhaps more familiar with. Now, the thing with ultrasound imaging is that it's basically a slice sort of image. So in this, if you look at this little diagram here, you can see that how the slices, using these slice effect, we can look through different elements of the heart. So in this picture, we're looking down through the left ventricle, which is the main chamber pumping out to the body, and the right ventricle, which is the main chamber pumping out to the lungs. So the left ventricle is the most important one, and you can see it's roughly circular, and as the recording is made, you can see that the heart is beating there. Now, from these sort of images, we can make a variety of measurements. We can measure the thickness, we can trace the areas, and we can also use what's called M-mode echocardiography, and basically that's like taking a graph. So we direct one beam of sound across the heart and look at everything with time. And so you land up with a graph of time in this direction and location in this direction. So that you can see, if we look at the left ventricle, it's got this black chamber, and these are the two walls of the ventricle, and it's contracting and then relaxing and then contracting and then relaxing. And hopefully you can work it out that we can make various measurements at different times, measure the thickness, measure it when it's maximally dilated and maximally contracted. And from these measurements, we can make an estimate of heart size. So where's the evidence that links heart size and performance? Well, the same group, again, Leslie Young and her colleagues based at the Animal Health Trust, again funded by the Horse Race Betting Levy Board, have looked and done a really very substantial study over several years. So what they did was they went out and did ultrasound scans of 482 thoroughbreds engaged in all sorts of racing, and they measured the heart size, estimated the weight, and collected the racing performance and looked at all the usual indicators, number of races, earnings, time form rating, and so forth. And this was the first time that we had actual proof that long-held theory that a large heart was a benefit on the racecourse. They were able to show that, particularly in steeplechasers, or well, I should say horses running over longer distances over jumps, that there was a very close correlation between heart size and performance. And using their statistical models, they're basically able to come up with the conclusion that 25 to 35% of the variation in performance could be related to the heart size, and that if the heart size was closely correlated with performance in longer races over jumps. So it's less important on the flat in horses running over shorter distances, but I think it makes sense that it's the horses that really have to run for a long distance that the heart size is going to become increasingly important. Now the next question is, well, does the heart change in response to training? Well, the answer to that is very much so. So what we've got here is some estimates of heart size in, I think there were about 8 horses in this group. This is a study I did myself. We've got horses at the beginning, or 2-year-olds I suppose, going into training, and you can see that the heart range in heart size at the beginning in these horses increases dramatically after just going from 26 days in training through to 60 days in training. So obviously the horses themselves are growing, so these sizes are corrected for body weight, but they are getting, the heart itself is getting proportionately bigger in response to training. So you can see where I'm going to go with this. The key question is, can we actually use heart size measured early in life, i.e. at the yearling sales, to predict future racing performance? So I'll just talk you through this graph. These are data from about 450 yearlings measured in this sort of December, January time. And then what we did was, if we start off with the blue bars, split the group into those that were raced and placed, and those that either never ran or they did run but they weren't placed. And if you each column represents 1/10 of the group, so we've divided them up into 10 equal segments based on their heart size. So these are the guys with the small hearts, and these are the guys with the big hearts. And you can see, it's sort of as we step through this graph, from the smallest 10th, the next 10th, the next 10th, the next 10th, it's going up every time. More and more of these horses are raced and placed. Then it sort of levels off at about the 40% mark. So that's kind of encouraging. More horses with, encouraging perhaps. The best conclusion from that is that it's not so much that the ones with the big hearts did well, but the ones with the smaller hearts don't do so well. But now then, let's have a look at the red bars. These are the horses that were black type, either winning or placed. And you can see that they are scattered everywhere. So if you chose your horse solely on the basis of a heart size and decided that you were going to discard the guys that had the little hearts, you would also be discarding ones that ultimately turned into black type. So it doesn't quite work. When it gets down to picking individual horses, then this heart size thing doesn't quite work. So I guess what I'm trying to get across is that as a group, overall, the more successful horses will have larger hearts, but there are so many factors that come into play in the individual that the heart size itself is just one of many aspects of conformation. And I think that's the way I like to think about the heart. The heart is something inside that you guys can't see, but it's just another element of conformation, in the same way as whether or not it's got nice straight limbs and so forth. You'll all be aware of many horses that have poor conformation but yet are very successful. And are there any downsides to having a large heart? Well, now I'm getting more into the territory that vets traditionally occupy, the sort of gloomy end of the spectrum. Of course there are downsides. And I'm going to go through these 3 different topics, hopefully reasonably quickly, just to give you some of the insights to the less good aspects of having a large heart. Before I get into that, I thought I'd just start off by talking about leaking heart valves. How would you suspect that a horse has a leaking heart valve? Well, the answer is that it will usually have some form of murmur, and hopefully my murmur is going to play. So this is not quite true to live recording because it sounds a little bit electronic now that it's being played through the system, but what you're listening to there is it's got a sort of whooping noise. That's the heart murmur. And that's fairly typical of the sort of murmur that you might hear in a young thoroughbred at the sales, and it's located on the left-hand side. And what about valvular regurgitation in thoroughbreds? How common is it, and does it affect performance? Well, again, we're going back to research produced by Leslie Young's group and funded by the Horse Race Spelling Levy Board at the same time as their magnificent effort scanning all these horses and looking at their performance. They listened to their hearts to check out whether or not they have murmurs, and they did what's called Doppler ultrasound, which is a way of identifying leaks within the heart. And they found that various important things. The first is that there are 3 important valves, of which 2 of them commonly leak. So here in this little graph, we've got the proportion of horses that had leaking heart valves in flat racing in the blue and jump racing in the yellow. And you can see that the National Hunt horses had a much higher prevalence of heart murmurs, and also that they were extremely common. So the mitral valve is on the left-hand side. I think it was about 22% of the jump horses had murmurs there, and on the right-hand side even more. It was 44% of their population had heart murmurs, which sounds rather alarming, except that they were able to look at the race performance and found that neither of these 2 common forms of murmur had any effect whatsoever on racing performance. And I think perhaps we can have a show of hands later, but I suspect that might not come as a huge surprise. Many of you will have come across horses that a question has arisen because they've got heart murmur, only to find that that horse is absolutely fine. And we know a lot more about leaking heart valves than we did perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's easy to imagine that a heart valve is some sort of tight seal, but in fact we know now that we've got ultrasound and other tools like that, that valves are not tight seals, that leaks and murmurs occur at structurally normal valves. So just because a horse has a murmur doesn't mean he has heart disease. And in fact, all the same processes, such as the release of adrenaline, which you've all seen the effects of the release of adrenaline. The horse sweats a lot and all the blood vessels under his skin pops up. The mediators that are affecting the blood vessels also affect the heart valves, and they can make them floppy when the horse is relaxed and work more efficiently when it needs to. The other important thing to remember about the heart is it's a muscle. Just like any other muscle, it will grow and change in response to exercise. So we believe that horses develop these murmurs because their heart starts to get muscly and it starts to change in shape. And so this is a normal process. It's not any sign of disease. And how can we tell that? Well, again, it's back to the ultrasound imaging. We can use ultrasound to look at how the blood is flowing through the heart and identify little leaks. And this one that I've picked here is so small that I probably can't even necessarily show it to you, but when you see in the still picture there's a little blue flash, that's a little leak in the heart valve. Before I leave the heart murmur bit, just also wanted to point out that while I've been telling you that heart murmurs generally don't affect racing performance, it is important just to remember that cardiac enlargement can be a sign of, it can be due to disease. So it's a good thing up to a certain limit, but if the heart starts to get really massive, the most likely explanation for that is that there's something wrong with it. So just to compare heart size, this is the heart scan from our young horse at the sales that I just played the murmur. And this is probably the most recognizable sort of picture. You've got like a Valentine's heart on its side, so you've got the 2 atria here and the main pumping chambers down here. Over here, you can see a horse that wasn't in such great shape. You can probably tell that because I was able to show you his heart. But these ultrasound pictures are made shortly before he died. This is a young horse that had developed heart muscle problem. And the main thing to notice is that his heart has now got so big we can no longer even see it all in the one image. And also if you look at how it's moving, it's just sort of wobbling like a jelly, as opposed to this guy that has strong regular contractions. So let's move on to the next downside of having large hearts. Horses with larger hearts are prone to getting rhythm irregularities. And I'll just talk you through how the heart rhythm works in horses. So you'll all have heard about the pacemaker, which means something different to me than it perhaps does to you. But the pacemaker is the area of tissue within the heart from which the heartbeat starts. And it spreads out across the top of the heart, and then it goes down into the main pumping chambers. And I've got a little video here to explain all of this. So we've got the top and then the bottom, top and then the bottom. That's the atria, then the ventricle, atria, then the ventricle. So it fills and contracts, fills and contracts. Okay, so everyone's got that image. That's how it works. Now, if all the heart muscle is nice and uniform, then the electrical activity spreads through it in a nice, organised manner. That's what you want, nice, uniform heart muscle, a wave of electricity going through it. If the heart muscle is somewhat heterogeneous, then this wave can break up and start to go off in little random tangents. And if we have an increased heart mass, as the thoroughbred does, then that further propagates the ability for the rhythm to go irregular, because these little wavelets that start breaking up in the electrical wave can always find something to move into. And heterogeneous heart muscle and an increased heart mass are the two factors that we need to create rhythm irregularities, and the thoroughbred athlete has both of these. So what I want you to notice here is just how irregular this heartbeat is. So we'll have long pauses, then short pauses, and then a little run of beats, and it's quite chaotic. This is a recording of a horse with atrial fibrillation, which is the commonest rhythm irregularity that horses get. So now I've got my little man to show you how it works. So we've got random electrical activity going on at the top, that's his arms. And then you can see that his pumping chambers are in trouble, aren't they? They're going randomly and they're not beating in a regular sort of manner. So atrial fibrillation is random electrical activity in the upper chambers with a regular beating of the lower chambers, the pumping chambers. When the horse is resting, that doesn't really matter, because as I explained earlier, the heart is so efficient it doesn't really need to be beating efficiently when the horse is just standing around. But atrial fibrillation becomes important in horses that are expected to perform at peak levels. And because of this link with heart size, in this part of the world, it's the steeplechasers that are the group that are probably most prone to getting it. And other parts of the world, standardbreds for some reason are particularly prone to getting atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation can occur probably far more than we actually realise, because it can be a very short-lived thing. It can happen literally for just 5 minutes or so, and then it's gone, and you can't hear it anymore. And this was a really interesting study that was done in Japan, and I don't think you could do this sort of study anywhere else but Japan, because it involved the vets being incredibly efficient. What they did was that every horse that was slow finishing, and I should have looked up the definition, I think it was maybe 6 seconds after the winner, I forget exactly. Anyway, they had a definition of what a slow finishing horse was, and for every single one, they went out and managed to do an ECG. In the UK anyway, by the time someone had figured out, okay, the horse is slow finishing, and they get back to the stables, and they think, oh, maybe we better get his heart checked, and they find a vet, and blah, blah, blah. The problem is gone, so everyone will still be mystified. But basically what they found was that 0.3% of slow finishing horses had atrial fibrillation. I'm sorry, 0.3% overall, and almost 1.5% of horses that finished badly had atrial fibrillation. But as I'm emphasising, in most situations, if you didn't have a vet standing by with an ECG machine already, you wouldn't even realise what had happened. Because in 92% of these horses, the problem went away without any treatment. Most horses that do this do it only once. That's certainly been my experience, that you'll sometimes get horses where basically a trainer will call up and say, oh, I was at the races yesterday and the vet listened to the heart and said that it was irregular, and you go off down to have a listen to the heart and the heart sounds fine, from which the trainer invariably concludes that the vet at the racecourse is a lunatic. Actually, the vet at the racecourse is almost certainly right, it's just that the horse will have self-corrected. Usually that's a one-off situation. Sometimes it happens again. In my experience, if it happens more than once, it will keep happening again and again. Atrial fibrillation can also be a persistent problem, though, so it doesn't self-correct, and it's those ones that we perhaps know more about because we can investigate them, because they're still fibrillating when you go and listen to them the next day. And these horses will have variable histories of poor performance, reluctant to exercise, so forth, and some of them will be bleeders. And the usual story is that they bleed very severely and they've never been known to bleed before. It's just something to be aware of. Obviously, many horses bleed. The majority of horses don't have atrial fibrillation, but a proportion of them do. So if you have a horse that suddenly, unexpectedly has a nosebleed, then you should always get its heart checked. I've played you that one before. And what do we do about this? Well, the conventional way to treat them is with drugs, and the most popular drug is called quinidine. It suppresses the electrical activity, and as we give increasing doses of quinidine, the heart rate speeds up, and eventually, hopefully, if all goes well, the heart rhythm goes back to normal, which is what you can see here. Problem with quinidine is it's a really nasty drug. It has kind of stood the test of time because it works pretty well, but the horse will be sick if it's given quinidine. Every single horse looks a bit miserable when it gets it. Some of them develop colic, which is what you can see here, and if they get bad colic or diarrhea, that's the usual reason for treatment failure. Once the horse starts to colic, you can't give him any more, otherwise it will just get worse and worse. So the alternative way of treating it is electrical. Sorry. So we're going to give this horse a shock soon. Here we go. So I'm going to switch off the sound now. So basically, this is what happens in people when they get atrial fibrillation nowadays. They give them electrical shocks. The machines aren't powerful enough to do it across the chest, so we have to put electrodes inside the heart and deliver shocks across the heart. And so we do that with 2 electrodes, one in the right hand side and the other in the left hand side, and we use both ultrasound and x-ray to position them and basically deliver the shock, and if all goes well, the rhythm goes back to normal. We do all the placement of the electrodes, that's the most difficult bit. That's done with the horse sedated, but obviously if you're going to give them the shock, then you have to anaesthetize them in case they run away. The final downside to having a large heart is there's just this nagging worry that maybe it's related to sudden death. There is no evidence at the moment that directly links heart size to exercise-associated sudden death, but I think we're all familiar with stories of horses dying during races, on the gallops and so forth, and the heart does feature quite prominently, as you might guess. It seems that the thoroughbred probably is prone to sudden death in comparison to other breeds. In this pie chart, I've got a breakdown of 268 deaths from a group based in Edinburgh at the Royal Dick Veterinary School. First thing to notice is that even although these horses had detailed postmortems in a quarter of them, there is no explanation for why it died suddenly, and that is very much the case. The next thing to notice is that cardiac lesions, either proven or suspected, occupy probably about 35%, and then Pulmonary failure is another major group, so either suspected or confirmed pulmonary failure. But as I say, the heart is often a likely candidate. In terms of risk factors, we know that thoroughbreds as a whole are relatively prone to sudden death. This study from the same group showed that there are 0.3 deaths per 1,000 starts, and they were looking at risk factors. And down here I've got the breakdown for different types of horse and the likelihood of them dying suddenly on the racecourse, and you can see that steeplechasers are very much the group that are more likely to die suddenly during races. Other factors, in case you're interested, are summer racing, age, no huge surprise, but getting older, they're more likely to die, longer races, but on a more positive note, starts in the last 60 days was protective against dying suddenly. So just to finish off, sorry if I've gone on too long, but wanted to just recap the main points and try to answer this question: is big always better? The thoroughbred heart is adapted for athletic performance. All thoroughbreds have very efficient hearts, but we've got good evidence now that increased heart size does improve cardiac performance and race performance, particularly over longer distances. But while it's true that horses with smaller hearts are less likely to perform well, some do, so therefore looking at heart size in individual horses is not a particularly good predictor. Leaking heart valves and murmurs develop with increasing heart size, along with increasing heart size, as a response to training, and we've got good evidence now that most of these horses with heart murmurs are going to be absolutely fine in terms of racing performance. Some horses with large hearts develop atrial fibrillation, and as I just touched on at the end, the thoroughbred, when you think about the breed as a whole, is prone to sudden death, but we have got no reason to directly link that to heart size at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention.